This video is part of a series that discusses a few literary theories in an introductory capacity. Don't expect any nice flashy visuals, as this is pretty much a slideshow with some voiceover. This video will discuss new criticism, and is intended to help someone understand the basics behind this literary theory. This entire video also only makes use of one reference, the Unisa study guide for the Introduction to Theory of Literature. This video is technically meant to help students doing that module, but it should be educational to anyone who wants to learn a little about literary theory. According to the current study guide, all the information on new criticism can be found on pages 82 to 93 and 154 to 158. So, without further ado, let's get to it! First things first, this video ties in quite closely with the video on Russian formalism, which was the prior video in this series, so it would be good to watch that one before watching this one. The link to it will be in the description below. Anyway, let's get to it. New criticism, or Anglo-American New Criticism, was a predominant form of literary analysis and criticism that still has its influence on modern analysis and criticism. Many of the ideas proposed by this group would go on to be rather integral to the analysis of literature in general. This theory had a similar bend to it that you would find in Russian formalism, because it places its focus on the intrinsic features of a text. It wanted to pay close attention to the text itself and nothing that existed outside of it, or at least not in theory. We'll get to how that wasn't exactly the case in time, but for now, let's chat a bit about its history and where it came from. New criticism emerged in the 1940s and would have an impact for decades to come, but it started in both the Anglophone world, so English-speaking Europe, i.e. Britain, and it also entered the academic consciousness in the United States, hence the name Anglo-American New Criticism. From this, we can see that it has a bit of a distinction from many other theories, which tended to originate in the non-English-speaking world. Russian formalism was, obviously Russian, Prague structuralism obviously came from Czechoslovakia, and the whole post-structuralist movement came out of France. So here we have a very English theory. Some of the major thinkers in this theory were people like I.A. Richards, W.K. Wimsatt, and Monroe Beardsley. There is also one particularly famous member of the New Critical movement, and he's pretty famous for being a rather pretentious writer, and that would be T.S. Eliot, the man who wrote poems like The Wasteland and The Hollow Men. If you did high school English, then you probably had to study something by T.S. Eliot. The main thing that these thinkers wanted to focus on was form and content. If you remember from the video on Russian formalism, form is the physical aspect of a text, such as the words themselves, the structure, etc., and the content is the actual meaning behind the text. The Russian formalists didn't much care about the content side of things, and they were more focused on the, technical linguistic side. The new critics, on the other hand, saw these two as intrinsically connected to one another. The form gives rise to the content, after all. So, the new critics wanted to focus on how the form produces the meaning that can be found in a text, and much like Russian formalists, they wanted to make this into a kind of science. They wanted to show that literature has value in and of itself. Literature should be detached from all those extrinsic things. So much like Russian formalists, they didn't care about any of the psychological, sociological aspects of literature. Who cares which society made it? What matters is whether the poem is good, right? The new critics did this by focusing on what is called a close reading, and this is basically exactly what it sounds like. They read something closely. The way to put it might be to say they read critically. If you just watch a movie and enjoy it and don't really think about it, then you're not performing a close reading. If you pay close attention to what you are watching, analyzing as you watch, then that is a close reading, or at least close to a close reading. You'd probably want to take out a pen and some paper for a close reading, so you can take notes along the way. This method is now considered a very basic way of reading a text with a critical eye, and it's quite important to be able to do it when you go into more advanced literary theory. So why do they want to use this method? Well, because they saw literature as a potentially autonomous form of knowledge. It can teach us a lot. They wanted to see literature as something empirical, something that could be studied, analyzed, and understood. And if you want something to be empirical, which essentially means it's scientific and can in some way be proven through experience of some description, then you need to have a rigid form of study. They want this because they want to show that literature can be about concrete concepts that provide us with truth and universality. Now, we need to discuss each of those to fully understand them. If something is concrete, that means it's real. That's a very simple one, but truth and universality are a little more complicated because they are still up for debate. Many people do not really agree on what those two things are either. So, at its most basic, truth is obviously truth is what's true. Simple, right? And universality is when a concept applies to everyone. A universal value. You might say a universal value is something like killing is wrong. There we go, most people can agree on that in theory. Here's where these concepts get rather complicated though. Okay, truth is supposed to be objective. It's supposed to be factual. There is only supposed to be one truth, right? The world is a certain way, and we all agree that it is a certain way. But the issue is that you may have heard the expression your truth before. Your truth implies that truth can be subjective. It can be opinionated. What is true for one person is not true for another. For instance, it is true for me that a falafel burger is absolutely delicious, but someone else may disagree. So here's the question, which of those is true? Is falafel delicious or is it disgusting? The truth, obviously, is that, yes, falafel is a food. That's pretty much true, and it has a taste. That is objectively true. But is that taste good? That's a value judgment, isn't it? So can it be true? Let's take this to a more literary point. Is the novel The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco a good book? I think so, but it's clearly a book that was made with people like me in mind. It's very literary and full of intertextual references. It's a great book, to me. Someone else may disagree, and is there anything that I can do to prove that it is true that that book is a good book? I can state my points, and a person might agree with me on those points, but then use those points to say it's bad. It's a rather dense literary book. That's good to me, but maybe not to someone else. Are either of us correct? That's the problem with truth. So we can already see a bit of an issue here with the new critical way. They believe literature can provide us with truths, but won't we all disagree on those truths? But that's where they try to solve it with the universality argument. Well, literature should be about universal ideas that apply to all people, losing a loved one, struggling with one's identity in a changing world, etc. These are universal. And yes, they are rather universal, but here's the problem. The new critics were all, white men, so if there was a book about the struggles of being a woman in society, well, that's not universal, is it? Women are not all people, so a story about women cannot be universal, obviously. But a book about the struggles of war and losing one's comrades, that is universal. Ignore the fact that most militaries only allowed men at the time, and so a story about war was also only a story about men. But a male story is a universal story. Men are all that exist. And never mind a story about fighting against racism, because that doesn't apply to white men, so it can't be universal, okay? The new critics wanted literature to be something universal and objective, but sadly for them, life is, rather subjective and fragmented. They wanted a clean form of analysis, but by doing so, they attempted to ignore a lot of reality. They wanted something objective, but by choosing what they saw as truth, they ended up being discriminatory. If you're black, a woman, poor, gay, etc., then your stories are not universal. They don't apply to the rich white men who claimed to care about universality. Now, it's probably good to point out that there is nothing inherently discriminatory in new criticism itself. The theory claimed universality, but the people who wrote a lot of the theory just had a skewed idea of universality. You could be a gay, black, transgender writer and believe in new critical ideas while rejecting the discrimination that its main proponents attempted to propose. The new critics, the people, not the theory, cared about the work of dead, white, male, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, heterosexual people. But you can reject those people and use the theory to understand far more. If you use close reading, you're not a racist. Just maybe don't use close reading to try and justify racism, which is what these theorists kind of did, especially because of their reverence for the canon. Now, if you don't know what the canon is, good, you should ignore it because it's very classist. But let's talk about it anyway. The canon is the body of writing that makes up the greatest works within that culture. So when we talk about the canon, we are often talking about the Western canon. Think of writers like Shakespeare, Oscar Wilde, Daniel Defoe, etc. The big name famous people that you may have studied in school. The new critics wanted to preserve that legacy, and as you can probably tell, they were all white and most were men. The few women admitted to this elite canonical circle were writers like Jane Austen, George Eliot, and the Brontes, the big names. But we couldn't go poisoning this elite group with the thing white conservatives fear the most: diversity. Why couldn't they allow that? Well, mostly arrogance. These people were also pretty colonial in their thinking, so allowing the colonized people to be admitted to their club would have been most unwelcome. Remember, literature is meant to be an autonomous thing that is not about extrinsic things like, real-world racism and sexism, although this is quite hypocritical, as one of the most famous works by a new critic, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, is kind of about post-war Europe, among other things, but, oh well. So, we've kind of spoken about the main points and issues, but ultimately, New Criticism left us with a good way to analyze text that was somewhat overshadowed by the discriminatory beliefs of the main proponents of it. There are also a few things worth discussing that the new critics brought to the table, namely the affective fallacy, the intentional fallacy, and the heresy of paraphrase. I've actually discussed the first two in my video on ethical consumption of media, which will be linked below, but let's briefly discuss them now because they show an interesting side to New Criticism's dedication to so-called objective analysis. The affective fallacy is the idea that it is a fallacy, therefore a mistake that you can make when analyzing, to respond to something emotionally. You might say that a book made you sad. Well, according to this fallacy, your emotions don't matter, child. This shows that the new critics didn't want you to respond emotionally. You're meant to be detaching yourself and looking at the book as if it didn't produce any feelings in you. What does the book show? Who cares how it made you feel? The intentional fallacy went on to reinforce this to a degree by saying that the intentions of the creator do not matter. If you, as a reader, are claiming that this is what the author said their book's about, then you are in the wrong. Who cares what the author says? What matters is what the book itself says. And the heresy of paraphrase is kind of tangential to this, and it claims that it is a heresy, which implies that literature could be viewed like something religious, to paraphrase work. No analysis, which will always be paraphrasing parts of the book to understand it, can capture the full meaning of the text. This is an interesting idea because it shows that humans are not actually that good at finding the supposed truth. Humans are instead good at finding parts of a text that they want to discuss, and not the entirety of it. This is a theme that would be explored later by more structuralist and post-structuralist thinkers. So, what are our main takeaways here? We only care about the text itself. Who cares about anything outside of it? And we want to pay attention to both the form and the content to understand the knowledge that this text is trying to provide us. If you ignore the discrimination parts, then this is a pretty good idea, but we can't just ignore the bad, can we? We need to acknowledge it and actively work against it. But that's it for New Criticism and message-centered theories for now. You need to understand both Russian formalism and New Criticism to understand the strengths and weaknesses of both, and to understand why focusing on the text alone might not be enough. But that will be explored in the next video in this series. And that's the end of the video for now. So, yes, do the things. Subscribe if you haven't. Like, comment, share. Do the things, like discuss the video. Discuss the theory, rather. You don't have to discuss the video. Talk about the theory itself to some people. Have some fun. Chat about literature. Think about it a bit. It's a good time for some. Anyway, that will be the end for now. So I hope that you have a splendid day further.